In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Vincent Coll was the most feared and hated man in the whole of New York, not just amongst his fellow mobsters, but also amongst the average citizen on the street. The most terrifying hitman of his time. If there was ever a man who symbolised the ruthlessness and violence of organised crime from this era, it was Vincent Coll. He single-handedly turned the Bronx and Manhattan into shooting galleries and became the most hated man to walk the streets of New York when, after a failed hit on a henchman of Dutch Schultz's with who Coll was engaged with in a bloody 2-year war, Coll missed his target and unfortunately shot and killed a 5-year-old boy in Spanish Harlem, earning him the moniker of a baby killer, and due to his particularly violent personality and his willingness to kill, he was later dubbed by the papers and the mayor of New York City, Jimmy Walker, as Mad Dog Coll, a nickname that stuck. In fact, he was so feared as a hitman that in 1931, Cosa Nostra chief Salvatore Maranzano opted to hire and trust the Irish-born Coll over all the soldiers in his Italian mob to kill nobody less than Charles Lucky Luciano and his equally terrifying second-in-command, Vito Genovese. This shows the reputation that Vincent Coll had around the city. This is the story of how an Irish-born Bronx hoodlum lied, cheated and murdered his way to the top of the New York rackets during the 1920s. This is the story of Vincent Mad Dog Coll. Vincent Coll was born in Shun O'Collar on July the 20th, 1908 in the Irish-speaking parish of Gweedore, a beautiful but impoverished region of County Donegal, Ireland, whose biggest industry in 1908 was emigration. He was born in the Huidai Beag Tavern, which his father was the owner of, in Bunbeg, a Gaelic-speaking village in Gweedore. Coll was the youngest of Anthony and Annie Coll's 7 children, and when he was just 11 months old, they decided to follow suit, as many Irish residents did, and leave for America in 1909. They sailed over on the SS Haverford, which departed from Liverpool, and arrived 8 days later at Ellis Island, the busiest immigrant inspection and processing station in the United States at the time. Once they were through the cattle-like inspection carried out by the guards of Ellis Island, the Colls settled on Cortlandt Street in the Bronx Assembly District 33, where Anthony found work as a subway guard and Annie stayed at home to look after her 7 children. Cortlandt Street was not the stereotypical Bronx poverty-ridden tenement building which you would tend to associate with immigrants at the time. They were able to settle on a more lucrative area of the Bronx as Anthony had a healthy inheritance from his recently deceased father, who was a wealthy landowner back in Ireland, not to mention the proceeds from the sale of the tavern which he owned back in Gweedore. The Colls lived in a relatively nice home and were a decent family, with a father who provided for his children and a mother who didn't have to struggle like most of the New York population at the time. Disaster struck in 1916, however, when Vincent was just 8, as Annie, his mother, died of tuberculosis, aged just 42. Anthony then deserted his children in 1920, just 4 years after his wife's passing, unable to cope with looking after them. The Coll children then moved into their Auntie Mary Toole's home on East 150th Street. Mary was a widow and the sister of Annie, who had also moved over from Gweedore in Ireland. Tragically, Vincent lost his 2 eldest brothers, Thomas and Charles, in 1921, who both succumbed to tuberculosis like their mother, and having lost his whole support network by the age of 13, things quickly began to unravel for young Vincent. Shortly after his 2 elder brothers died, he was expelled from the Bronx public school which he attended, and his Auntie Mary sent him to 3 different Catholic reformatory schools where Vincent also didn't last long. He was kicked out of these schools for either attacking his teachers or fellow students, and he generally showed a strong disinterest in education. Vincent had lost his 2 elder brothers and his mother before the age of 13 and believed that he was also doomed for the same fate, explaining that he didn't want to waste any time in education. Mary didn't force him to attend another Catholic institution, and Vincent was left to roam the poverty-stricken and knife-plunging streets of the Bronx in the early 1920s. While school books had shown no attraction, Vincent was a fast learner in another form of education, that being the art of crime, and he quickly fell under the wing of Oni the Killer Madden, the head of the Gophers Gang, a 500-strong adolescent street gang who were based in the Irish neighbourhood of Hell's Kitchen and controlled most of Manhattan's underworld. Vincent quickly acclimatised himself in the Gophers and became one of Oni Madden's most trusted soldiers, keeping a watchful eye over the streets of the Bronx for him, where run-ins with the law and other gangs were inevitable. In 1924, aged just 16, Vincent was arrested for carrying a gun, and by the age of 18, he'd been arrested more than 15 times. Vincent was quickly coming to the attention of more established gangsters who could see the Irishman's potential and wanted to snap him up for their own organisations, which is exactly what Dutch Schultz, the biggest gangster in the Bronx, did. In the early 1920s, the 18th Amendment was passed, which prohibited the sale, production and transport of alcohol, also known as Prohibition. This was great news for mobsters like Schultz, who before Prohibition had relied on protection money and robbery to make their crust. They now had a nation who longed for a drop of the good stuff and had nowhere to get it, or so it seemed. Speakeasies began cropping up all over New York where you could get a drink quietly without the police or specialised prohibition agents knowing. Most of these speakeasies in the Bronx were owned by Dutch Schultz and his partner Joey Noy, including the Hub Social Club located in a tenement building at 543 Brook Avenue in the South Bronx, which Coll and the rest of the Schultz-Noy gang made their headquarters. This underworld sale and distribution of alcohol led to some incredibly violent times during the 1920s and subsequently led to this decade being dubbed the lawless years. Gangs fought bloody wars with each other for territory of clubs and speakeasies, and even hijacked each other's trucks which carried the booze from their suppliers, who were usually located in New Jersey or Canada. Vincent was appointed as an armed guard on the beer delivery trucks for Dutch Schultz and began to acquire quite the reputation for himself. Coll's fearlessness, violent personality and willingness to commit murder on demand made him a valued enforcer to Dutch Schultz, and as the Dutchman's criminal empire grew in power during the 1920s, he employed Vincent as his main assassin, quickly assigning him his first job. Schultz would often send Vincent to rival speakeasies in the Bronx who refused to buy booze from the Schultz operation. Needless to say, after some slight intimidation from Vincent and his older brother Peter, who had also joined the organisation, most speakeasy owners complied with their new distributor and began buying the booze. Occasionally, however, you would get the odd speakeasy owner who would refuse to agree, and this happened in 1927 when Anthony Borello and his wife Mary Smith, who owned a small speakeasy in the Bronx, flat out declined to buy beer from the gang and opted to continue selling their own homebrewed booze and bathtub gin. Vincent returned the next night with his brother Peter and another member of the Schultz entourage, Fats McCarthy, and shot Anthony Borello and his wife Mary Smith 3 times each with his pistol, killing them both instantly and in front of over 15 witnesses who were drinking in their establishment. Vincent was arrested a few days later for the incident and stood trial, but the charges were eventually dismissed thanks to his new boss, Dutch Schultz. Not only had he bribed the jury, but Schultz had also leveraged his political influence in the way of corrupt Tammany Hall leader Jimmy Hines, who was on the Dutchman's payroll, and helped to decrease the seriousness of the crime and make the charges magically disappear. Vincent Coll was now free to walk the streets and resume his assassin activities for Schultz, of which he would be needed. By early 1928, Schultz, who was now dubbed the Beer Baron of the Bronx, and his partner Joey Noy had begun to expand their operation into Manhattan and began targeting some of the speakeasies located here to force them to buy their booze. This was the long-established territory of heavyweight mobster Jack Legs Diamond, and the two factions engaged in an all-out battle which resulted in the death of Joey Noy, who was gunned down outside a Manhattan nightclub called the Chateau Madrid, located on West 54th Street on the morning of November the 11th, 1928, subsequently passing away 10 days later at Roosevelt Hospital after wasting away to just £90, with the Dutchman staying at his bedside the entire time. The death of his partner devastated Schultz and retaliated by sending his gang, led by Vincent Coll, out onto the streets, murdering any Diamond associates at will. In fact, just 2 hours after the first shots were fired at Joey Noy, a blue Cadillac with a door missing containing the bullet-ridden body of Legs Diamond gang member Louis Weinberg, bullets which had been fired from a Thompson submachine gun wielded by Coll. During this bloody war with Legs Diamond, Coll spotted an opportunity to again move up in the ranks of the Schultz entourage, casting his sights on the recently vacated spot next to Dutch Schultz that the late Joey Noy had once held. In 1929, Vincent Coll and another Schultz underling, Carmine Borelli, pulled off a heist without Schultz's permission, robbing the Sheffield Farms dairy on Webster Avenue in the Bronx. They posed as armed guards to gain access to the cashier's room, where they stuffed their sacks with over $17,000 in cash and walked calmly out the back door, all without a gunshot being fired, something completely uncharacteristic of anything Vincent Coll was usually involved in. This angered Schultz immensely, but Coll didn't care that he hadn't acquired his boss's permission before carrying out the robbery. The truth is that Vincent needed cash to fund his now extravagant lifestyle. He was known for his dapper dress sense, something the tight-fisted Dutchman was not. Vincent spoiled himself in silk shirts, tailored suits and countless fedoras, usually tilted to one side. He was drinking in the most expensive clubs and driving the fastest cars, drawing even more attention to himself. Standing at an athletic 5'10" with a baby face and curly blonde hair, the papers at the time were quoted as saying the charming and charismatic Coll could have made it as a movie star had he not chosen a gun instead. When Dutch and Coll next met, Dutch confronted him about the robbery, asking why it was carried out without his blessing or authorization, reminding Coll that he could only operate with his approval. Instead of being apologetic, Coll told Schultz that it was his reputation and methods that helped craft his empire, and astonishingly demanded to be made a partner. But Schultz's one and only partner was dead, and as far as the Dutchman was concerned, no one could take the place of Joey Noy. Tension developed between Vincent and Schultz, who had once been close friends, and these tensions were not good news for Coll. Whilst Coll was a dangerous and unpredictable killer, as covered in a previous video, Schultz was on a whole other level of viciousness, and Vincent had made a cold and ruthless enemy, but for now, he remained on the Schultz payroll. In January 1930, Coll had hatched his plan to depart from the Schultz organisation and start his own mob with existing members of the Schultz entourage who were not happy with the lack of career prospects and the payment arrangement. Unlike most criminal organisations in the city at the time, Dutch Schultz paid his crew a flat weekly wage instead of the customary percentage from the crew's take like most other gangs did. This led to numerous members of the Schultz entourage looking for a way out of the tight-fisted Dutchman's gang, something Coll wasn't afraid to spearhead. There had also been tension between Vincent and Carmine Borelli since they pulled off the Sheffield Farms dairy heist, stemming from an argument over how they were going to split the spoils, and now Carmine Borelli had caught wind that Coll was planning to branch off and form his own crew. Coll feared he would spill the beans to Schultz, who would inevitably act with violence, and so, before a war broke out, Coll decided to take action. In the early hours of the morning of February 13th, 1930, Borelli and his girlfriend, Mame Layton, were walking back to their apartment on Inwood Avenue and West 170th Street in the Bronx when they were met with a barrage of machine gun fire from Vincent Coll and two other Coll loyalists, Patsy Del Greco and Frank Esposito. The gunmen sped off in a vehicle driven by Fats McCarthy, and shortly after, Coll was charged with the double homicide but again discharged due to a lack of evidence. The hit on Carmine Borelli enraged Dutch Schultz, as this showed weakness in his mob to other outside criminal crews who would pounce at any slight opportunity of unrest amongst the ranks. He declared war on Coll and the two factions began a battle for territory and power, one which flooded the streets of New York in blood. The Coll Gang, as the press were now referring to it as, was not lacking in numbers, which does show that many of the members of the Schultz mob had grown a distaste for their previous boss and his miserly ways. In this new crew, Vincent's right-hand man was his older brother Peter, but they also boasted some serious cold-blooded killers in the way of Frank Giordano, Tuffy Adorno, Patsy Del Greco, Fats McCarthy, Michael Bazile, Frank Facciano, Arthur Palumbo, Jimmy DeLucia and Roy Herbert Sloan. This was a large portion of Schultz's firepower, and his crew had been significantly depleted as a result of Coll branching off. After the Carmine Borelli hit, things didn't explode into complete murderous pandemonium like most of the New York underworld expected it to. And this was partly due to Schultz's ongoing problems. Not only was he still hell-bent on getting revenge against Legs Diamond for murdering his old partner Joey Noy, but he'd also another major enemy in the form of newly appointed special prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was a straight-edged man who was unbribable, unlike the rest of the New York Police Department who were on the Dutch's payroll, and Dewey was relentlessly pursuing the Dutchman on tax evasion charges. But the temporary peace on the streets was also partly due to a new romantic love interest of Coll's, namely in the way of Lottie Kreisberger, the absolute definition of a gangster moll. The usual suspects when we think of a gun moll are names like Bonnie Parker or Virginia Hill, but Lottie Kreisberger, or Lottie Coll as she went by, although the two were never married, became a major shot caller in the Coll Gang after meeting Vincent in 1930. She was 9 years Vincent's senior, having been born in New York as Charlotte Denninger in 1899. Lottie was a problematic child and had been in trouble with the police since a young age. A streetwise and tough German Jewish immigrant, similarly to Dutch Schultz, whose real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, Lottie later explained in a newspaper interview that she had had to learn how to fight as well as the boys in her neighbourhood if she was ever going to make ends meet. In her youth, Lottie specialised in burglary, mainly shops and apartments in the Bronx, before she married Samuel Kreisberger in 1917 and had a daughter the following year. She was a gangster in her own right and was arrested for bank robbery in 1919, but the charges were dropped shortly after. However, this did result in her husband Samuel divorcing her and taking custody of her daughter. After several romantic interests with a few low-level crooks like Adolph Romano and Sam Medal, Lottie met Vincent Coll in a speakeasy in Manhattan, and the two quickly became infatuated with each other, never leaving one another's side and spending most of their time in their Manhattan apartment, hence the relative calmness on the streets throughout the whole of 1930. Fast forward to May 1931, Dutch Schultz had now beaten his tax evasion case after bribing the New York jury, and for the time being, Dewey was off his case. Legs Diamond was hiding out in Albany after remarkably surviving 2 assassination attempts from Schultz's men, the 4th serious shooting Diamond had been on the end of, and was still living to tell the tale, which the press were now rightly dubbing him as the clay pigeon of the underworld. With Diamond over 150 miles away, Schultz decided to turn his attention back to his ex-main hitman and realised he'd sleep a lot easier if Vincent Coll and his crew crew were no longer breathing, and he was prepared to raise hell on the streets of New York to make that a reality. On May the 12th, 1931, shortly after midnight, Coll gang member Roy Herbert Sloan was in the Mad Dot Boat Club, a speakeasy located at 251 Dyckman Street in Upper Manhattan, with 3 associates, chewing the fat and passing the time of night. At around 1 a.m, Sloan and one of the men walked outside the club. Seconds after exiting the club, a car parked down the street and started its engine and drove slowly past the entrance of the club, when suddenly the passenger car door swung open and a man armed with a shotgun began firing. He fired 2 shots, both hitting Sloan. Whilst his companion fled, Sloan staggered before collapsing on the sidewalk, where he unfortunately died from his wounds. It's thought that Dutch Schultz received a tip-off that it was Coll who was drinking in the club, as he bore resemblance to Sloan, but the source was mistaken. Either way, Schultz had spilled the first blood of this war, blood which would continue to flow and flow relentlessly. 2 weeks later, Coll responded. On the evening of May the 28th, 1931, high-ranking Schultz associate Joey Rayo was standing outside a speakeasy at 164 East 116th Street, getting some fresh air amidst the New York summer. He was with 2 more Schultz men, Dominic Louis Slats Bologna and Frank Big Dick Amato, when around 10 a.m, a car cruised by jam-packed with 6 Coll members armed with Tommy guns who began blasting at the trio. Amato was killed instantly with over 15 bullets to the chest and neck. Bologna was also hit and managed to stagger to the Alpi restaurant a few doors down and asked the owner to call him an ambulance before collapsing and succumbing to his wounds. Coll had taken out 2 Schultz gang members, however his main target, Joey Rayo, managed to rush into an alleyway and escape without so much as a scratch. This aggressive response from Coll sealed the deal in both gangsters' minds. It was all out war from then on in, and Schultz was about to take out a member of the Coll gang, which would send Vincent into a grief-stricken, uncontrollable rage which would eventually earn him his moniker of Mad Dog Coll. At around 2 a.m. on May the 30th, 2 days after Vincent had taken out 2 of Schultz's men, Peter Coll, Vincent's brother, was driving in West Harlem near Central Park. When he stopped at a junction, a blue sedan pulled up next to him and 3 gunmen began blasting their pistols in his direction before speeding off, leaving no witnesses. Peter was hit 7 times and rushed into the nearby 5th Avenue Hospital by police when they arrived at the scene, but was sadly pronounced dead shortly after. The murder of his brother decimated Coll, hitting him the hardest he'd ever been hit. Harder than losing his older brothers, harder than losing his mother, and even harder than his dad deserting the family. Peter was only 2 years older than Vincent, and they'd grown up together. They were born and raised in the same tavern in that remote village of Benbug in Gweedore, County Donegal. They had sailed together on the SS Haverford to New York. They had gone through all the grief the family suffered together, been expelled from Catholic school together, joined and then rebelled against the Dutchman together, and now his partner in crime had been cruelly ripped away from him, and Vincent Coll would not stop until he painted the streets of Manhattan in Dutch Schultz's blood and avenged his brother Peter. Vincent Coll wouldn't wait long to begin his vengeance either. The day after Peter was murdered, there were around 12 Schultz associates lounging around shortly after midnight at the Hub bowling alley on East 149th Street in the Bronx. Watching the handful of players who were bowling, the Schultz men didn't notice when 3 smartly dressed men walked in. When the manager of the bowling alley asked the 3 men if they wanted to play, they said they were just going to spectate like the Schultz associates, who they claimed were friends of theirs. The 3 men, however, were no friends of anyone associated with Dutch Schultz, and they were Patsy Del Greco, Vincent Coll, and Fiore Basile, brother of Mike. Just after 2:30 a.m, there was only a handful of the Schultz men remaining, one of which was 20-year-old Gennaro Chin Yadaroli, who was known for running local craps games and being a vicious money collector for the Dutchman. Conveniently, Just as a thrown ball connected with the pins, Patsy, Vincent and Fiore backed up to the exit and unloaded their pistols at Yadaroli, killing him instantly, and Coll wasn't about to stop there. On June the 2nd, Coll and his gang broke into a garage owned by Schultz, presumably one Coll used to help guard, and smashed over 120 vending machines with crowbars before setting 4 trucks on fire that the operation used to transport their illegal booze. The next day, the body of Louis DeRosa, a Schultz associate, was found in a car parked in the southern section of the Bronx. DeRosa was executed professionally with 3 gunshots to the head, and it is believed Coll carried out this hit given that he was the main assassin in the Schultz entourage and would possess the level of skill needed in the execution of Louis DeRosa. On June the 8th, the body of 24-year-old John Jacoparo was found in the back seat of a Buick sedan parked not far from the Bronx Zoo, with 6 bullet wounds in his back and head. Jacoparo was one of Schultz's truck drivers, and it was clear with the last 2 attacks that Coll was trying to harm the Dutchman's main income stream. Perhaps he knew that Dutch could keep replacing the men he was murdering with other ambitious crooks from the Bronx, and therefore to hit the Dutchman where it hurts, the tight-fisted and sociopathic Dutch would feel more pain from losing money than he would a human life. A week later, 46-year-old Abe Rosenberg was found with a singular bullet through his brain and his skull crushed in Queens, a few blocks from where his car was parked. Rosenberg was a collector for Schultz, specialising in the intimidation of speakeasy owners, a position that Coll had once held. And it wasn't just the tactic of picking off Schultz's men that Coll was using to win this war. He had also tipped off the feds about some of his former boss's illegal activities. On June the 18th, 1931, Schultz was in his 9th floor apartment of the swanky 5th Avenue building, where he was known to the doorman and concierge as Russell Jones. Recently, with Coll on a ballistic rampage, he had been spending most of his time in his apartment and quite rightly had been scared into reclusiveness. The evening of June the 18th was one of the rare occasions that Schultz had actually stepped out of the building. For the last few hours, Schultz and his bodyguard, Dangerous Danny Yemeska, had been observing 2 men they thought were Coll boys through their binoculars on the street below. Trepid with paranoia, Schultz and Yemeska confronted the 2 men and, taking no chances, Dangerous Danny drew his gun to warn the Coll boys that they meant business. Unfortunately for the duo, the Coll boys actually turned out to be NYPD detective Steve DeRosa and Julius Salke, who were in fact staking out Dutch's place, but on orders from Thomas E. Dewey, who was again trying to build a case against the beer baron of the Bronx. In retaliation, the 2 NYPD detectives drew their weapons and fired bullets at Dangerous Danny, who collapsed and died in hospital a few hours later. The Dutchman had it away on his toes, navigating the Manhattan back alleys and sidewalks, shouting to members of the public to help as there were 2 men after him. At the time, the Dutchman still didn't know the 2 men were NYPD and was under the impression that they were Coll gang members. When the detectives caught up to Schultz and revealed that they were police, the Dutchman began laughing in relief, explaining that, "Jesus fellas, you scared the shit out of me. I thought you were gangsters. There's a lot of them after me, you know." DeRosa and Salke arrested Schultz on possession of a handgun, took him back to the station, took this picture and released him on a $75,000 bail. It's widely believed that Coll had given Dewey the Dutchman's address through a corrupt NYPD officer who was on Coll's payroll, and things were not going to get any easier for Schultz as long as Vincent was around. 3 days after Dangerous Danny Yemeska was murdered by the NYPD, 31-year-old John Sorocelli, a high-ranking member of the Schultz mob, answered his front door when the doorbell rang. Waiting on the other side was Vincent Coll and Patsy Del Greco, who immediately fired 4 slugs into Sorocelli and fled in their waiting car. Amazingly, Sorocelli didn't collapse from the assault. He staggered to his bed and asked his wife for a cigarette whilst waiting for the police to arrive before he passed away from the bullet wounds a few hours later. Dutch Schultz then had the idea to try and use the police to his benefit as well, albeit not as smartly as Vincent Coll. Perhaps he had been on the whiskey that afternoon, or perhaps he was driven to an uncontrollable level of madness by the barrage of blood that Coll was spilling in the streets, but unbelievably, Schultz boldly meandered into the 42nd Street Police Precinct in the Bronx, walked into the detective's room and said, "I'll buy any one of you a house in Westchester County if you kill Vincent Coll. He's driving me out of my mind." When challenged by one of the detectives on whether he knew what he was saying or where he was, Schultz told them, "Yes, I know what I'm doing. I've been here before. I'm just saying I'll pay good to whichever cop offs the mick." It's hard to imagine a time so carefree where the biggest gangster in New York could walk into his local police station and offer them a house for murdering his greatest rival and end a war which was leaving so many bodies around the city. Understandably, Schultz was ushered out of the station and told not to return. With his barbaric bribery proposal unsuccessful, remarkably Schultz reached out to Coll and asked him to stop the war. Schultz had felt it more on his side after losing 5 of his own men, 120 vending machines and 4 beer trucks in the last month. Coll agreed, accepting a large sum of money from the Dutchman, and a truce was called. However, both men would neither forget or forgive. There was peace again in New York, but only for now. Despite the stalemate between the two men, Vincent Coll did manage to bully his way into the control of some sections of Harlem and the Bronx which were previously under Dutch Schultz's control. He soon became an owner of a number of bars, not by purchasing them with hard-earned money, but by telling the previous owners they would be killed if they did not leave New York. Given Vincent's reputation and recent track record of bloodshed, they all left and he successfully increased his territory. Coll was quickly becoming a major player in the New York criminal landscape. Along with the money flowing in from the bars, Vincent needed another source of income to fund his free-spending lifestyle and his ever-growing crew who were on his payroll, and so he turned to kidnapping. The gang began kidnapping rival mobsters and holding them for ransom. This completely alienated Vincent in the underworld, leaving him with no friends whatsoever. Whilst undeniably violent and unhinged, he was no fool though. Coll knew that there was no way the mobsters would report the kidnappings to the police, as they would have a very difficult time explaining to the Bureau of Internal Revenue, or the IRS, why the ransom cash had not been reported as income and where it had come from. However, it wasn't just gangsters that he kidnapped. Vincent and his gang began to diversify, and he started kidnapping show business stars and successful businessmen along with fellow mobsters. He began with show business legend Rudy Vallee, and the Coll gang received $100,000 for the singer's release. Next to be taken was Sherman Billingsley, the owner of the Stork Club, the most famous restaurant in New York, whose family paid Coll $25,000 for his release. Then Billy Warren was bundled and thrown into the back seat of the Coll gang's car. Warren, a successful New York banker, parted with $83,000 to gain his freedom. With a lot of ransom money being paid to the NYPD as bribery money, they also didn't interfere with the kidnappings despite numerous complaints. In the most brazen kidnapping so far, Coll and his associates hopped into a sedan and drove over to the Club Argonaut on 7th Avenue. There, they kidnapped the club's owner, George Jean Big Frenchy DeMonge, an associate of Oni the Killer Madden, Coll's former mentor back when he was a firm fixture in the Gopher Gang. Oni himself had excelled through the New York underworld and was now the owner of Harlem's Cotton Club and a real heavyweight of New York, even someone Dutch Schultz wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of. DeMonge wasn't just an associate of Oni Madden's, he was a partner in a string of Manhattan rackets, ranging all the way from booze to extortion to protection to boxing matches. Oni Madden had power in Manhattan that rivaled the police force, and here was Coll with the sheer nerve to kidnap his partner in Midtown Manhattan, right on Madden's turf. Towards midnight, Coll called Madden and arranged a meet-up where he would release his business partner. Madden paid $35,000 for DeMonge's release and began plotting his revenge. There were many other kidnappings that followed but did not receive publicity at the time, mainly of fellow mobsters who didn't want the IRS finding out about their undeclared ransom money. All of the kidnappings carried out by the gang added to the growing wealth of Vincent Coll, who was now not only rising up the ranks of the underworld in reputation and fear, but also in money and power. There was one thing that Coll was missing, however: he craved fame. The kidnapping enterprise was not generating much publicity for the gang in the newspapers. Vincent was a very vain man who craved the notoriety of perhaps Oni Madden or Dutch Schultz, two of his fellow gangsters that he had pissed off in recent weeks. Coll was frustrated that his terror tactics were not making him a superstar when he was drinking in the New York nightclubs. What Vincent failed to realise was that Madden and Schultz would pay a lot to journalists to help promote them in a positive light, and not link them to the odd body that turned up on the sidewalk or a speakeasy which spontaneously burnt down. Coll's criminal activities, when they were actually reported, didn't command any feelings of respect or adulation from the general public. Vincent could spend his ill-gotten gains on his new fedoras, his silk shirts, his tailored suits. He could come across as intelligent in interviews and handsome in pictures. However, he and his gang were so feared for their brutality that no matter what kind of picture they tried to paint of themselves, everyone thought of them as common criminals. There was no gentlemanly aspect to Coll's personality, and therefore no respect given to him when he was in the clubs of New York like there was when Lucky Luciano, Oni Madden or Dutch Schultz pulled up. The club owners reacted to Coll with fear and, quite rightly, they saw him as a vicious young thug who was extremely dangerous and might even kidnap them, not as a gentleman gangster with respect, and therefore the punters in their clubs also thought the same way. This was something that deeply annoyed Vincent Coll. Not only did Vincent want respect from the general public and his fellow mobsters, but above all he wanted respect from his fellow Irishmen, again something that wasn't forthcoming, and he was deeply humiliated at an Irish fundraiser in Brooklyn towards the end of 1931. A dance had been organised by fellow Donegal immigrants for a family from Coll's hometown of Gweedore, whose house in the Bronx had recently burnt down and they had lost everything. Vincent went along with Lottie and they were dressed to the nines. Whilst a lot of the immigrants were struggling to get by, Vincent and Lottie entered the dance hall in designer clothes, looking every inch the successful couple, and they wanted everyone there to know about it. It's no secret that Vincent had lost touch with many of his fellow Donegal immigrants as his criminal career took off, and this was the first time that many of them had seen this infamous gangster in the flesh after reading about the gangster from Gweedore, as the press referred to him as in the papers. They didn't hold him in awe or respect like he desired, but they feared him. Vincent was expecting a celebrity welcome, but to these Irish men and women who were struggling to make ends meet, he was nothing more than a violent and notorious killer who was giving their heritage a bad name in their new home. In fact, during the dance, no one approached him to give him a friendly greeting or marvel in wonder at his success. Everyone he did talk to made no secret of their fear and distrust towards him. It was clear to Vincent that he was not welcome even amongst his own people, and his ego was seriously wounded. And in fact, there were several of Coll's cousins present who actually left the venue upon his arrival in embarrassment, failing to even acknowledge their own blood. This cut Coll deep. He had seen how the same people respected Oni Madden, also the son of Irish immigrants, and as mentioned, he longed for the same respect, but this wasn't about whether you were a criminal or not. This was the fact that he kidnapped innocent people and exploited their families for cash. Innocent people like the ones in the venue who did not want to know him. Coll was shocked and hurt. Despite all his wealth, reputation, designer clothes and attractive girlfriend, it was clear that his fellow Donegal immigrants despised every inch of his being. The Gweedore immigrants had left Ireland to escape poverty. They journeyed across the Atlantic just like Coll to America to find a better life for themselves and their children. They were working every hour God sent to send their children to college, buy their own homes, and the brutal lifestyle lifestyle of Coll and his gang was, to them, a menace to decent people and a threat to the integration and respect of the Irish into American society. Coll's moniker of the gangster from Gweedore was one that many of his countrymen were also embarrassed and angry at. They viewed this as not only an insult to them but also to their parish of Gweedore back in Ireland. That night highlighted to Coll that he was not welcome amongst the Donegal Irish in New York and he would limit his contact with them later on. The press also got wind of this rejection from the community, to which an embarrassed Coll would later brush off his trip to Brooklyn by describing the Gweedore people as little nobodies who were jealous of my success. He also stated that the Gweedore people in America lacked ambition and were willing to settle for little weekly salaries instead of reaching for the stars as he had. He also said they were cowards who were afraid of the police, further alienating him from the community. Perhaps still angry from this incident, when Coll was arrested for an unrelating kidnapping a few weeks later, he telephoned Dutch Schultz from prison and threatened to spill the beans on the Schultz operation, something Vincent knew inside and out, if the Dutchman didn't post his bail. Left with no option, Schultz paid the $75,000 bail, and a few weeks later, Coll failed to show up for the trial, which forfeited Schultz's bail money. Again, Coll knew how to get at Schultz where it really hurt and refused to compensate the Dutchman for his loss. Schultz was still keen to keep the peace in New York for now, however, even after Coll's latest swindle, but Coll had no intention of keeping the peace and would launch an attack to exploit Dutch Schultz even further, committing the most shocking event in Vincent's life and the one he is remembered for today. Coll plotted another kidnapping exploit, but this time targeting a high-ranking member of Schultz's mob, a member he had already tried to kill 2 months prior, Joey Rayo. In the middle of a heatwave that had already taken 20 lives on both the Coll and Schultz side, New York City witnessed one of its most notorious gang war killings. Instead of lawless gunmen falling to the wayside, 5 innocent children were senselessly shot down in a kidnapping attempt on Rayo. On this steamy hot evening, as children played on the sidewalk along East 107th Street and adults leaned out of open windows in the hope of catching a slight breeze, an open touring car containing 5 men including Vincent Coll slowly made its way down the block. As it passed the Helmar Social Club, the men spotted Joey Rayo lounging out front. With one gunman blasting away with a shotgun and another with a .45 automatic pistol, gang warfare reached an all-time low. 5-year-old Michael Vengali was hit and died the following day. His 7-year-old brother was wounded 5 times, and a 3-year-old sleeping in a stroller was hit twice in the back. 2 other children, 5 and 14 years old, received slight wounds but survived. Despite the angry public outcry, including this broadcasted footage of Michael Vengali's mother uncontrollably mourning at his funeral, police were hard-pressed to find anyone in the neighbourhood who would talk to them, a measure of the frightening reputation that Coll held in the city. Rayo had spotted his assailants and ducked for cover. When the shooting stopped, he stood up and calmly walked away. 5 days later, an eyewitness to the shooting, George Brett, came forward claiming he had been standing across the street as the touring car drove by. Brett identified Vincent Coll and Frank Giordano as the 2 shooters. When Coll's name was released to the newspapers as the main suspect in the shootings, the press dubbed him a baby killer, and the FBI named him as #1 on its famed top 10 most wanted list. New York Mayor Jimmy Walker, the son of an Irish immigrant, christened Coll as a mad dog, and the nickname made for great headlines, and it stuck to this day. The public was outraged by Coll's actions, and Police Commissioner Edward P. Mulrooney dramatically increased the police presence on the street, issuing a shoot-to-kill order should any officer encounter Coll or his mob. As a nationwide manhunt was on for him, Vincent dyed his blonde hair black and grew a moustache. He was scarcely seen around town and spent most of his time cooped up in a room he rented with Lottie at the Cornish Arms Hotel on 23rd Street near 8th Avenue. However, he continued the war with Schultz, and he was hell-bent on putting an end to his old boss's operations and life. Whilst on the run, the newly christened Mad Dog approached Jack Legs Diamond, who was still exiled from New York City and running his operation in Albany. Coll wanted a way out of New York as the heat was too much even for his fearless mind. Vincent explained they both now had a powerful and dangerous enemy in Dutch Schultz, and they should forget about the Big Apple and instead combine their efforts and attention to smuggle beer and whiskey into other states far away from New York. Legs Diamond gave it some thought and was confident the duo could make a fortune, even overlooking the fact that Coll was one of the gunmen present in a failed assassination attempt on Diamond ordered by Schultz 2 years prior. Diamond eventually agreed, which was a relief for the Mad Dog, with the noose firmly tightening around him in New York, one which would become a lot tighter in the days that followed. Coll returned to New York from his meeting with Diamond in Albany and began his offence in the now resumed Coll-Schultz War. On October the 2nd, 27-year-old Joe Mullins was in charge of one of Schultz's garages located at 2918 Park Avenue in the Grand Concourse section of the Bronx, another lockup that Vincent was familiar with. At around 10 a.m, Mullins was standing in front of the garage when a brown Buick pulled up. Frank Giordano was behind the wheel, and Vincent quickly jumped out of the passenger seat, walked up to Mullins and pumped 3 bullets from his pistol into Mullins's head. Vincent then reached into his pocket and tossed 2 pennies on Mullins's lifeless body, now lying on the sidewalk. This was a message to Schultz that Coll was in an even more ruthless mindset, and that 2 cents was the mere value of Mullins's life. The next day, on October the 3rd, 8 Prohibition agents were in the process of raiding the Majestic garage located at 1262 Westchester Avenue in the Bronx, another location used by the Dutchman as a distribution warehouse for his booze. As the agents were confiscating the illegal goods, the same Buick from the Mullins murder the day before pulled up, and Vincent Coll threw a stone through the window before Tuffy O'Derno quickly followed it with a homemade bomb which exploded seconds after. Fortunately, no agents were harmed, but the building was destroyed, meaning that Schultz couldn't have used the property again even if he wanted to. With these fresh attacks on the Dutchman, Coll had made it clear to Diamond that he was serious about their newly formed alliance, but before the duo could organise the operation of their new alliance, New York Police State got wind of the plans and captured most of the Coll gang overnight, with Coll being arrested around 9 a.m. on October the 4th in his room at the Cornish Arms Hotel. He was charged with the capital murder of Michael Vengali. The general consensus in New York was that Coll was to be found guilty and sentenced to death. Now, on the front pages of the press, they were printing that Coll had an urgent appointment with Sing Sing's renowned electric chair, Old Sparky. Mayor Walker, ever conscious of public opinion, made it quite clear that he wanted a quick trial, a guilty verdict and an execution as soon as possible so he could put an end to the massive public anger directed at Vincent. However, this was not to be, as the Mad Dog would again, luckily, be acquitted in what was a bizarre trial. In late December 1931, Coll and Giordano were tried for the murder of Michael Vengali. Coll was ably defended by Samuel Leibovitz, one of the city's high-profile defence attorneys who was much used by the gangster fraternity, and for good reason. Leibovitz was the most successful criminal lawyer of his generation and the go-to man whenever a major criminal figure needed a defence lawyer. Leibovitz tore apart prosecution witness George Brett during cross-examination. He told the jury that Brett had fabricated the story in the hope of collecting $30,000 reward being offered for the killers. Leibovitz claimed that Brett had acted in a similar capacity in another case where his testimony could not be substantiated. By the end of the trial, the jury found Brett to be an unreliable witness. It later came to light that Brett had a speciality of being an eyewitness to a few murder trials in St. Louis and collecting the reward money. The judge agreed with Leibovitz, and George Brett was committed to the psychopathic ward at Bellevue Hospital, the same hospital that Joey Noy died. The trial was now deemed a farce, and the courtroom descended into uproar at this revelation. The prosecution case had collapsed, and the judge was left with no other choice but to let Coll walk free. Despite this close shave and remarkable let-off, Vincent did not learn his lesson and embarked on what would be a costly mistake, accepting a contract to murder Charles Lucky Luciano, one of the most powerful gangsters in the whole of America. The current capo dei capi, or boss of all bosses when translated to English, in the American Mafia was Salvatore Maranzano. He appointed himself to this position after taking out his arch-nemesis Joseph Masseria, which marked the end of the bloody Castelmarese War, and Maranzano began reorganising the Italian-American gangs in New York into 5 families led by Luciano, Joe Profaci, Tommy Gagliano, Vincent Mangano and Salvatore Maranzano himself. Each family would have a boss, an underboss, capos, soldiers and associates. The families, composed of only full-blooded Italian-American members, would allow associates from any background, but higher-ranking members of the families would have to be Italian, something Luciano did not agree with, as despite being Italian himself, his closest friends and colleagues were all Jewish. When Luciano raised this to Maranzano, he completely dismissed Luciano's request, and Maranzano called a meeting of crime bosses in Wappinger Falls, New York, and declared himself capo di capi, boss of all bosses, and it was his way now or the highway. He also seized control of all rival families' rackets to benefit his own. While Luciano seemed to accept these changes, he was merely waiting for the right moment to eliminate Maranzano. Though Maranzano was slightly more progressive than Masseria, Luciano believed he was even greedier and more conservative than Masseria ever had been. Maranzano's scheming, his arrogant treatment of subordinates, and his fondness for comparing his organisation to the Roman Empire, attempting to model it after Julio Caesar's military chain of command, did not sit well with Luciano and his ambitious friends, such as Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. Despite advocating for modern organisational methods, with crews of soldiers doing the bulk of a family's illegal work under a capo regime supervision, Maranzano was fundamentally a moustache Pete, an old-school mafioso too steeped in old-world ways. He opposed Luciano's partnerships with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Luciano decided that his unacceptance of many trusted more than Maranzano had sealed his fate. Salvatore Maranzano eventually realised Luciano's plans and knew that he was a threat. Over all the fellow Italian soldiers he controlled in his own family, he turned to hiring Irish-born Vincent Coll to take out Luciano, which shows the absolute measure of the reputation of a hitman Vincent had. Despite the risks, Coll readily agreed to murder Luciano for a whopping $50,000, the highest amount ever offered at the time for a single mob murder. Maranzano later invited Luciano to a meeting at his office located at the New York Central Building, now the Helmsley Building, at 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan to discuss a redrawing of the mob map in New York. The real plan was for Coll to arrive later and assassinate Luciano during the meeting. Luciano, who had a large network of informers, was alerted by a Maranzano associate called Tommy Lucchese about the plot against him and decided to act first. Luciano sent 4 Jewish hitmen from Murder Inc., the murder-for-hire wing of the mob, organised by Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. The 4 hitmen's faces would be unknown to Maranzano, and they posed as government agents, disarming Maranzano's bodyguards. They then walked into Maranzano's Luciano's office and stabbed him repeatedly before unloading at least 6 bullets into the boss's head before Coll showed up. Although Luciano knew he was in danger if he didn't act, he did not know the hitman that Maranzano had hired to end his life. The fleeing Jewish assassins, however, saw Coll arriving and informed Luciano that it was Vincent who had accepted the contract and must have been the intended assassin. This sealed Vincent's fate. An enraged Luciano ordered Coll's old boss from the Gophers, Oni Madden, to match the bounty of $50,000 that was placed on Luciano's head, knowing that Madden had the connections who could get to Coll. Upon hearing of this new £50,000 bounty on Vincent's head, Dutch Schultz decided to match it, and now the astronomical figure of $100,000, just over $2 million in today's money, sent shockwaves around the underworld, and the hunt for the Mad Dog was on. Numerous hitmen were eager for the bounty posted by Madden and Schultz, and 2 in particular, Leonard Scanici and Francis Fabrizio, known otherwise as Tony the Wop, really intensified their search for Mad Dog, and after receiving a tip-off, apparently from Dutch Schultz, they were on the Mad Dog's tail and thirsty for blood. On February the 1st, Fabrizio and Scanici, accompanied by 2 other unknown assailants, entered a card game taking place at a family home on 1216 Commonwealth Avenue in the North Bronx. The home was owned by Mike Basile's mother and had been the headquarters for Vincent and his mob ever since his acquittal the previous month. Just before 9:30 p.m, a car pulled up outside the 2-storey house which contained a dozen men, women and children. Responding to a knock on the door, one of the children opened it, allowing the 4 gunmen to burst in. Recognising the Coll gang sat in the front room of the house and using the element of surprise to their advantage, they unleashed a hail of bullets, catching everyone in the room off guard with no chance of firing back. Scanici, Fabrizio and co fled, satisfied with the professional job they had done, and they were sure that the $100,000 bounty would be theirs. When the smoke cleared, 3 were dead. The first, Patsy Del Greco, lay lifeless on the floor. Patsy was perhaps Coll's most trusted man since the death of his brother Peter. He was one of the first Coll loyalists to follow him over when he broke away from Schultz, and he had always been a key lieutenant in the mob. Fiorio Basile, another member of the Coll gang, met a similar fate and was also a huge loss to Vincent. 32-year-old and innocent bystander Emily Torrizello was killed by a singular bullet to the head. She was not involved in any way with the gang and was actually visiting the Basiles as a family friend and was tragically caught in the crossfire. 3 children present at the property were taken to hospital with minor injuries, but remarkably were unharmed in the bloodbath. Unfortunately for Fabrizio and Scanici, they proved too eager, as their main target, Mad Dog Coll, didn't arrive at the scene until 30 minutes after the shootings and quickly scarpered when he seen the police outside the house. If the assassins had held off for just half an hour more, they would have had their man. This carnage was absolutely brutal and made the front pages of the newspapers the following morning, again with Vincent the centre of the public outrage, despite him being the target, and the shocked New York authorities informed the mob that this ruthless bloodshed had to end. Whilst the NYPD would often turn a blind eye to many criminal exploits in exchange for a cut of the profits, with most NYPD officers either on Oni Madden, Lucky Luciano or Dutch Schultz's payroll, the negative press publicity surrounding Mad Dog Coll and his associates was becoming politically damaging and even worse, having a negative effect on the profits the NYPD officers were receiving, and with their organisations slightly jeopardised, Schultz and Madden decided to put an end to the Mad Dog themselves. A few days after the Commonwealth Avenue slayings, Coll received word that Oni Madden, whom he trusted from his Gopher days, wanted to speak with him. Coll was informed that Madden had worked out a settlement between the 2 criminal factions involved in the war that would make everyone happy, and most importantly for the Mad Dog, save his life. Vincent had known Madden for the majority of his life and trusted him even after Coll had kidnapped his business partner Joseph DeMonge and demanded money from Madden. In Coll's eyes, this slight ordeal hadn't impacted their friendship and loyalty at all, and this naiveness proved to be Vincent's fatal mistake. A meeting was arranged in Hell's Kitchen where Coll thought ostensibly he would be safe as the neighbourhood was under Madden's protection. To avoid any further mistakes and to ensure Coll would definitely be recognised by his assassins along with Scarnicci and Fabrizio, Dutch Schultz arranged for Bo Weinberg to accompany the men. Weinberg was a high-ranking member of the Schultz mob and had worked with Coll under Schultz, staying loyal to the Dutchman during the ensuing war between Coll and Schultz. Vincent was now a deeply desperate man. He was being hunted by every mob hitman in New York, all wanting a slice of the $100,000 bounty on his head. On February the 7th, Coll and his ever-loyal girlfriend, Lottie Kreisberger, again checked into the Cornish Arms Hotel on 23rd Street, and at around 12:30 AM that night, Coll left his lodgings to make a pre-arranged phone call with Oni Madden to receive details of the planned Hell's Kitchen meeting the following day. Carrying $101.48 and without a weapon on him, he entered the London Chemist drugstore across the road from the Cornish Arms Hotel and occupied one of the 3 phone booths at the back of the store and proceeded to ring Oni Madden. Mad Dog Coll was keen on the proposed truce with Dutch Schultz and the rest of the New York mobsters who had been hunting him for the bounty on his head. He was 23 years old, and to say things had been tough for the baby-faced Irishman recently would have been a majestic understatement. He was nearing broke, his crew was heavily depleted, and he was still mourning the passing of his brother a year or so prior. Most of his friends were dead, and Madden listened to this sob story and kept Coll on the phone long enough for Scarnicci, Weinberg and Fabrizio to arrive in a blacked out limousine around 10 minutes after Coll had first called Madden. Weinberg approached the window of the drugstore, spotted Coll in one of the phone booths and confirmed his identity to both Scarnicci and Fabrizio before getting back behind the wheel of the getaway car. Fabrizio waited at the door, expecting Coll's bodyguard to come rushing from the hotel at the sound of gunfire while Scarnicci entered the drugstore. As Scarnicci passed the man who was working the tills that night, George Scott, he turned to him and whispered, "Keep cool now and no one gets hurt," reaching for the Thompson submachine gun hidden under his overcoat. Scarnicci approached the telephone booth and from a few feet away unloaded the whole 50-round drum into Vincent Coll. Though an exact count of the bullets fired was elusive, Vincent Coll's body slumped forward out of the booth as Scarnicci made a quick exit out of the drugstore. Coll sustained severe injuries, with a slug shattering the right side of his face, breaking his nose and lodging in his brain. 2 additional bullets struck his forehead, 1 settled above his heart, and he suffered 7 wounds in the right arm and 4 in the left. Scarnicci left no room for doubt about Coll's fate. Scarnicci and Fabrizio jumped into the limousine and Weinberg sped off. The ordeal for the assassins was not over yet. 2 police detectives, ironically assigned to tail Coll, came running at the sound of gunfire. One jumped on the running board of a taxicab and ordered the driver to pursue the speeding getaway car. With the detective firing from the running board, the taxi driver chased the gunmen 27 blocks down 8th Avenue at 70 miles an hour before the getaway car pulled away. The hit on Vincent Coll lasted all of 90 seconds, and the most hated and feared gangster in New York was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report revealed that whilst a total of 15 bullets were removed from Coll's body at the morgue, it appeared that many more had passed through him, proving the lethal and professional job Scarnicci had carried out. Back at the drugstore, a crowd gathered to see the fallen baby killer. Lottie, who heard the deafening gunfire from her apartment at the Cornish Arms Hotel, came running from across the street, screaming as she forced her way through the swelling crowd of onlookers. Later, at police headquarters, Lottie played the gangster mole wife role to a T, refusing to answer questions and when she did, only giving half-truths. Vincent Coll's funeral came a few days later, with not many mourners at all for someone who had made the headlines so often in his short life. Vincent was buried at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx next to his brother Peter. Dutch Schultz personally sent a wreath to Coll's funeral bearing a banner with the message, "From the Boys," a hint to their previous organisation before Coll rebelled. Despite a love of glamour, fashion and a deep-rooted need to be respected, in truth, Coll was only really mourned by Lottie Kreisberger, who now identified herself as Lottie Coll, despite the pair never actually marrying. They had applied for a marriage licence in New York in January 1932, but with the murder of Vincent, they never set a date. Despite this, she would always be referred to in the press as the wife of Mad Dog Coll. In the story of Lottie Coll, she was arrested 6 months after Vincent's death for the accidental shooting of a bystander in the Bronx during a bank robbery. She served roughly 10 years at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, and after she was paroled in 1943, she completely disappeared from public view, even ignoring a warrant issued for violation of her parole. It's thought she moved out west and started a new life, even changing her name, but her fate was never known. As is normally the case in mob hits so violent, all 3 of the men involved in Vincent's death also met violent ends. Francis Fabrizio, aka Tony the Wop, was murdered 8 months after Vincent on November the 20th, 1932, after a botched murder attempt on Bugsy Siegel, a close associate of Lucky Luciano. He had threatened to speak with the police if Luciano and crew didn't stop their pursuit of him, and this proved to be his downfall when he was shot 3 times in his family home in Brooklyn. Leonard Scanici, the diligent assassin who ended the life of Mad Dog Coll, was executed in Old Sparky, the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in 1935, for a 1933 murder of a police detective during a bank robbery in Manhattan. Bo Weinberg didn't receive much gratitude from Dutch Schultz for his part in the demise of Vincent Coll. In fact, when Schultz discovered Weinberg was speaking with Lucky Luciano about dividing Schultz's rackets should the Dutchman face prison, with Thomas Dewey trying to convict him of tax evasion, Schultz and his men kidnapped Bo as he was leaving a Manhattan nightclub, encased his feet in a bucket of cement and tossed him into the East River. Schultz himself would only avoid Luciano's wrath for a couple more years, eventually sealing his own fate in 1935 after storming out of a meeting with Luciano and fellow mafia heavyweights after receiving the news that his request to murder Thomas Dewey, who is still pursuing the Dutchman, was not granted. Schultz insulted the mainly Italian commission and declared he was going after Dewey himself and will have it done within 48 hours. Luciano and the mafia knew how much heat murdering a government official would bring on their organisation and decided to act first, sending members of Murder Inc. to Dutch's headquarters, the Palace Chop House in New Jersey, where he and his crew were ruthlessly executed. Luciano himself pretty much oversaw all criminal activity in New York for the next 10 years before, as Dutch Schultz had predicted, Dewey also served him a prison sentence for running prostitution rackets, eventually sentencing him to 30 to 50 years in prison, where he continued running the crime family. His trusty right-hand man, Meyer Lansky, who was also dubbed the accountant of the mob, struck a deal with the Department of the Navy, who were concerned with German and Italian agents entering the US. Knowing that the mafia controlled the waterfront, Luciano provided assistance to the government throughout World War II, which helped them control the waterfront, and as a reward he was deported back to Italy in 1946 and died a free man in 1962. As for Oni the Killer Madden, well, he left New York in 1935, still under police scrutiny for the murder of Vincent, and knowing that the end was in sight for the Irish mob and that the Italian mafia were now in their ascendancy, he settled in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which had become known for being a haven for various criminals with a corrupt city government and police force. He ran several nightclubs there and became a naturalized US citizen in 1943, before also dying a free man in 1965, aged 73. So, the short and violent life of Vincent Mad Dog Coll concludes. A character who was born in a pub in a remote Irish village and completely epitomised the violence and the bloodshed of New York in the 1920s and early 1930s, turning Manhattan and the Bronx into shooting galleries and providing the city with its biggest gang war to date, where more blood flowed in the streets than ever before, and did it all in a short 23 years of life. Thanks so much for watching. Please do watch my in-depth documentary on Vincent's nemesis, Dutch Schultz, which will pop up now, and please like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.